Hello and welcome to The Rundown, a podcast from PoliticsHome. I'm your host, Alain Tolhurst, and with me to discuss Tory rebellions, levelling up, housing, planning, and a row over private schools is Conservative MP and former Immigration Minister Kevin Foster, Labour's Shadow Local Government Minister Sarah Owen, as well as Robert Colvile, Director of the Centre for Policy Studies think tank and one of the authors of the Conservative Party's 2019 election manifesto. And now this week, one of the big rows that we're seeing is around the levelling up bill, two amendments with lots of MPs signing on two sort of very different kind of issues, but very related. Firstly, on an amendment to scrap the mandatory housing targets, and a second one on to end the ban on onshore wind. I'm going to start with you, Rob. You said before we started that you're being blamed for both of these. You said in a column that any MP who backed these wicked proposals, scrap the housing targets, are spitting in the face of a generation and removing any prospect they will ever vote Tory. So, but since you've written that, more MPs have signed that. So how do you feel about your attempt to win round Conservative MPs?
Well, yeah, obviously my attempt to win hearts and minds didn't really work. Yeah, so two amendments, both in slightly different directions. One is the continuation of a long-running intifada led by Theresa Villiers and various others about the planning regime. The Tory manifesto, which you referred to, promised that the government was going to build 300,000 homes a year in England, and crucially in the places where people need to live and work. This hasn't gone down very well with lots of people in the places where housing pressures are highest. It's chiefly Tory seats in the southeast. The Cheshire Manor by-election they blamed for this. And so they forced the U-turn of Rob Jenrick's proposals to liberate the planning system, and now they're trying to sort of destroy the existing planning system that was there before. So it's not just one amendment. There's a sequence of amendments, but essentially what they do is make planning voluntary for councils rather than compulsory. So the way it works at the moment is you have that 300,000 target, then the government says, hey, local councils, this is actually how much you probably need to build in your area, come up with a plan to do it. And the Villiers amendments say you don't have to listen to the government when it says that, you don't have to identify any sites to put houses on, and there is to be no presumption in favour of development within the system, which holds that all other things being equal, if someone says, I'd like to build on this land and there's no reason not to, you should build on it. So that like really takes an axe to housing. It destroys the housing sector. Estimates are that it cuts 20 to 40% off the house building industry. House building sector thinks that's a £17 billion hit to GDP. All of the young people who can't get homes already, it absolutely screws them over. As Kevin will probably say, there are lots of legitimate concerns for Tory MPs in their own constituencies. Yeah. But the kind of response is basically, in order to protect my constituency, I'm going to just burn the whole thing down.
Right. They say it's not about stopping development, but stopping the wrong development in the wrong areas. But they're effectively sort of outing themselves as NIMBYs, really. This is kind of shaking his head. We'll come on to it in a second. But Rob, why do you think why do you think they're so pursuing on this issue?
I think it's a combination of factors. There are genuine local pressures. There's lots of areas where second homes and holiday lets are a huge issue. There's lots of areas where there's massive amounts of greenbelt and you can't really build on that. There is just electoral self-interest. There is a broader sense, which I wrote my Sunday Times column on recently, that that discipline is slightly breaking down. Yeah. That everyone thinks they're going to lose, so there's less incentive. There's this extraordinary stat that half of Tory backbenchers are now former ministers. In one of them, Senator. If you're a minister, what can you realistically offer them? There's not really enough places in the Lords for everyone.
Right, sure. And speaking of former ministers, we'll bring Kevin in now. You didn't sign that amendment, the Theresa Villiers amendment, but you did sign a different one, which was about requiring planning permission for change of use to tourist rental. I know your constituency is Torbay. There's a lot of issues with second homes and tourism. It looks like Michael Gove is said to be considering agreeing to this, not agreeing to the main and Villiers amendment, but maybe agreeing to this. What do you kind of make of that? Is that something you want to see? And what do you think of your colleagues who are signing the Villiers amendment?
Well, it's welcome if we can start seeing some control placed on the conversion into short-term holiday lets, because we have an eye, and I think perhaps listening to some of the points just made is one of the concerns from colleagues is actually how the targets work, how housing's being delivered, because there's little point saying, look, we want to deliver housing, meet local need, and then discover, let's say, half of it in a constituency like Torbay converts into a short-term holiday let, which wasn't what we were actually looking to deliver. And there are clear housing pressures that need to be met. I must say, I haven't actually signed the particular Villiers amendment.
And you're a good person.
Concern. Well, thank you. But it is how that, and also if councils are giving permissions, how many of that actually become housing completions? I think there's a astonishing stat of something like 1 million permissions that have not actually been built out.
That is just a nonsense stat.
So,
anyway.
but it is again though, having been in local government of things, you can have a lot of rows about giving a permission, then find yourself 3 or 4 years down the line taking a lot of flack, a lot of heat, and absolutely nothing to show for it in the way of people actually getting a home or getting permission. Now, that may not be quite so precious, for example, as like London, the South East, where once there's permissions granted, there's a very strong commercial incentive to get on and build it. But for example, in other parts of the country, you can see a permission granted, and then you're looking to see the actual housing created. So there is, I think, some legitimate points picked up amongst some of the commentary about, well, actually, how can we make sure that a permission granted is then built out? How can we ensure that when it's built out, it's actually delivering the housing we want, which is people able to get a home in their local community? And also, what you have a council, for example, 5-year land supply issues. If a council's really building out and doing well, then in theory, it then gets challenged that, well, you need even more land to be allocated. So there are some real practical concerns, and also just the time it takes to build stuff. I can think when I was a councillor in Coventry about 10 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, we were arguing about particular sites that are now just being built on. That gives a huge disincentive amongst a lot of the theory around this.
So, what's kind of Labour's thoughts on this? You've seen kind of the Tories tearing themselves apart, as usual, on all these kind of planning issues. What's kind of Labour's view, and what's Labour's plan for sort of house building, and how do you see this kind of the Villiers Amendment from
I think what we're seeing here is, although we've got rid of the kind of car crash that was Liz Truss's government, we're still seeing the chaos that Rishi Sunak is trying to handle and is failing to handle because of the Villiers Amendment and the rebels. He's failed to face them down, and he's had to pull this. So we actually don't have an amendment in front of us to vote on. We don't have a bill to discuss, and we want to be the sensible adults in the room and say we will actually lend our votes to the government to see some progress. It's not perfect, the Levelling Up bill, by any stretch of the imagination, but what we need to see, for all the reasons that were outlined, particularly for young people, we need to see some progress. And as Kevin said, this progress takes a long time to actually come to fruition. So we need to get on with that now.
What are your thoughts on kind of top-down targets? Because there's a lot of criticism of the Tory party that it's not helpful. Would a Labour government impose those sorts of targets to try and get things moving?
I think what we've got before us is not perfect, and obviously we need to have a discussion about how those targets are calculated and how they're enforced. But to get rid of targets altogether is so deeply irresponsible at the moment when we have a housing crisis. So in my inbox, we consistently get people that are coming to us with lots of issues: cost of living crisis, health issues, education, but always at the heart of it is housing, and it's overcrowding in housing as well, and people not being able to get onto the ladder.
Yeah, it's a central issue, isn't it, that comes, you keep coming back to it, that it always comes back to housing. We talk at the moment about, like you say, cost of living crisis. The fact is that private rents have massively shot up. Simon Clarke, who has been one of the people speaking out against the Villiers Amendment and has started the onshore wind amendment, he was saying that it's a big reason why he thinks that places in cities will not vote Tory because there's too many people living in multiple occupation houses and that sort of stuff.
It's not even just about home ownership. This is about renters as well. I mean, we have had nothing for renters from this government for the last 12 years, and we've been promised the renters reform. We've been promised that they're going to scrap Section 21 eviction, no fault eviction notices, and yet thousands of people are still having that. And I've got families coming to me now that have had to move into hotels because they've been evicted from their homes through no fault of their own.
Kevin, do you want to comment on that?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, I was just casting my mind back. I think it was a year ago, as Rob made, to like the Labour Party's social media campaign saying that Boris Johnson wants to build houses and we'd rather communities were able to decide instead. So it's interesting now, a year later, to see the change in view. But in terms of all local authorities, all councils, we know there's housing pressures, we know there's challenges. I think where the core of this comes down to is, if housing is delivered, will it be delivered in a timely way, not a permission land banked? Will it actually go to those who need to be accommodated? And even in some constituencies like mine, but certainly in areas around it, in parts of Devon and Cornwall, things like recruitment of care workers, NHS workers are becoming difficult, not because of visa arrangements, not because of workforce or budgets, but because they are going to struggle to find somewhere to live within any realistic distance. So I think there's some of the issues there that need to be teased out, not just put down as this is all NIMBY. And I suspect some of my colleagues will, of course, be very interested to see what we might hear at a national level, and then contrast it to what they might see in local campaigning from particular political parties against particular proposals for development.
Yeah, I can see the Lib Dems looming large in that. That thought's what there. Rob, as I said, you helped write the manifesto in 2019. Rishi Sunak has said repeatedly that, or his spokesperson said that he wants to stick to the spirit of the manifesto, not necessarily the stuff in it, but the spirit of the manifesto. How well do you think he's doing on that so far, and what else would you like to sort of see from him if he is going to stick to it?
Well, I mean, I think the weird thing about this is the levelling up bill sort of doesn't. I mean, it doesn't do anything on the on targets and the top down planning. What its real focus is, I mean, apart from the levelling up bit, which is obviously quite key, is on housing is the some of the other stuff which actually was in the manifesto about making homes more beautiful, making sure the infrastructure is there. I mean, Michael Gove has this this acronym called BIDEN, which is beauty, infrastructure, democracy, environment, and neighbourhood. And as he said when he outlined it to the CPS a few years, think tank a couple of weeks ago, his advisors also told him it could be in bed, in case he was worried about being seen to endorse the Democrats. But he thought being seen to endorse the Democrats was slightly better than being in bed with Michael Gove.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I was on a radio show the other day, and someone asked him if he was wearing an extra jumper with the heating contest. He asked someone, "You can come round and see me in my knitwear whenever you like." So I'm glad that Gove's moving on from that. So the issue, obviously, with the levelling up bill is this big row on onshore wind. And Simon Clark's on this moment. What's kind of Labour's thoughts on this as well? Obviously, you said that Labour might help lend its votes to the Tories to get through house building. What's your views on the onshore wind as well?
So on the onshore wind, obviously Simon Clark's loosens it slightly, but for us, we don't think it goes far enough, and we'd like to have an amendment that actually says that local people and communities should be able to say that they want the onshore wind. Because what we're seeing now is an energy crisis, and we need to have more security, energy security, and that means being able to produce our own energy. And one of those ways to do that efficiently is through onshore wind. At the moment, there is an effective ban because it could just be objected to by just one person. And that is not sustainable for the long term. And it's also not what the general public want. They want to see their energy costs come down. They want to see an end in reliance on kind of Russian and fossil fuels. And this is a way forward. And it's also a way to create sustainable green jobs.
Yeah. Sarah's right, isn't she? The public opinion is in favour of onshore wind. It's in favour of more house building. Why are your colleagues putting themselves on the other side of that?
Well, I've signed Simon's amendment. I do think we need to have onshore wind as part of the mix where the sites are all the usual caveats you'd expect me to give in the planning process. I'm not going to propose we plaster Dartmoor with them, but by the same token, there are sites that would be suitable and where there is genuine community support. So, it's not a magic bullet for our energy problems. We still need new nuclear. We still need other sources of energy. We still need to look at where we can source gas that we needed in the transition. Most people will still be, particularly working families, still be heating their home with a gas boiler for some years to come. But again, if we're having the thing and we need to look at all options, then I don't see a reason for continuing the blanket ban, and I suspect we will see some movement. Just the numbers are clearly there in the House of Commons.
It's always just felt like a really weird policy and then we're sort of held to because you kind of equated it with housing there, and it's not actually the same. Like housing is genuinely unpopular among large chunks of people especially in specific constituencies. Although overall there is actually most polls show people do want more homes built in their area. Yeah. But onshore wind, I think that it was banned. It was effectively banned, sort of shadow banned, as it were, under the Cameron government, among sort of genuine revolts over these awful, terrifying steel monstrosities that no one had ever come across, which were going to kill all the birds. What's happened in the subsequent 10 years or so is an extraordinary transformation in public opinion. There is, I keep having this argument on Twitter, but there is genuinely overwhelming public support for onshore wind among Tory voters, among rural voters, among people who already live near wind farms. Like it is not a controversial thing, and it is especially not controversial to do what Simon Clark is saying, which is not saying. Again, there's no imposition, there's no top-down level, just saying if councils want to approve them, they should be free to approve them. Yeah.
And what I don't understand is that a large section of the Conservative MPs that are against onshore wind are so pro-fracking. And I'm just like, if you're looking at destroying or protecting nature, why is it that this wind farm is so offensive?
If you're looking at things your voters will actually support.
And also, by removing this position in England, it would then really throw the spotlight back on the SNP and Scottish government's absolute refusal to even consider nuclear, which, of course, you have to remember, onshore wind's there, but we do need to have baseload generation, which includes nuclear as a zero-carbon energy. But, yeah, it's something that's popular, and I think if we're going to look at all all options to deal with the energy crisis, and this needs to be on the table as well.
But these are two key tests for Rishi Sunak. And I actually don't know what it is that he believes. And I think that this is a real fundamental question around Rishi Sunak about what his political beliefs are, because we haven't really heard them so far. He doesn't seem to have a huge amount of substance when it comes to these sorts of issues. I don't know where he stands when it comes to housing targets. I really don't know where he stands when it comes to onshore wind. So I think he's now got a test of leadership to get this levelling up bill through. And like I said, Labour will be the adults in the room, and we'll seek to improve it where we can do. We know it won't be perfect. It won't be exactly what we want to see, but it will be better than nothing.
Yeah, I've sort of put to me that the Tories are quite rebellious at the moment. The Tories are always kind of rebellious, but they tend to fall into line if there is a strong vision from the centre, from the top of the party. It doesn't feel as though we've necessarily seen that strong vision from Sunak yet. Do you think that's what's caused perhaps some of the splits, actually? There isn't something for MPs from all stripes to hold on to going forward.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say there's been debates about planning policy in the Conservative Party for some time, as there are in Labour and other major parties.
I was looking back at this is exactly the argument that Nick Bowles and David Cameron and everyone had, 10, 15 years ago. And it's exactly the argument that Nicholas Ridley had, and it's exactly the argument that John Prescott had. Right? This stuff, is like.
And while I can remember sitting as a councillor hearing, Labour MPs vehemently opposing the idea there should be housing built in their area based on national targets, which were set by Labour governments.
And
so,
I also think
it's not a new debate.
But that debate is very nuanced in terms of what kind of housing it is. Because if you're asking an area that has an average wage of £20,000 whether they want to have 5-bedroom houses built on there that nobody locally can afford, particularly young people,
it was a classic example of saying one thing nationally and then not wanting the impact of that locally.
I'm giving an outline here that as to why some of these debates are so kind of long-standing.
Although many people would actually say, if you want to, I've heard it said, if you want to attract companies to the north, if you want to attract, then you need to build homes for their executives to live in. So,
we had exactly the same problem in Luton. We had the college wanted to redevelop. It had a large piece of land. It's sold it off for housing development so that it could actually develop and make this beautiful building for students to learn in. But we had Lib Dems going against that locally, and somebody said to me, what I see is just it's destruction. And I said, well, what I see is also homes and hope for people, homes and education for people. The college wouldn't wanted to have sold that land off if they didn't have to, but they had to, because they weren't seeing the funding coming in anywhere else. And what I see now is a beautiful building that means that students could get top class education, and I'm also starting to see families move into those homes.
We'll come back to whether the Tories are ungovernable and unwhippable at the moment. I saw Kevin sort of sidestepped that one, but we'll come back to another issue that maybe the Conservatives are on the wrong side of public opinion. We saw this big attack on private schools, dominated Prime Minister's questions. I thought Keir Starmer's line about trickle-down education was quite good. What did you kind of make of that and the row in general about private schools?
I think that sums it up totally. I really don't understand why anybody would have a problem with saying that private schools are not charities and therefore shouldn't be having these tax breaks. If they are education providers, then they should want to help the community around them. If they're a viable business, then they should be able to function without these tax breaks. Ultimately, it comes down to that. And what I find really difficult is when people have it, and families that I represent, and also families that I grew up in, being told that if you worked hard enough, then you'd be able to afford to send your child to private school. My parents, at some stage, my dad worked 3 jobs as a firefighter, a lorry driver, window cleaner. My mum quite often worked in a Chinese takeaway as a nurse. They worked all the hours that they had and still wouldn't have been able to afford to send me to a private school. Education should be for everybody. A good education should be for everybody. It shouldn't just be for the people that can afford it. And I don't understand how this row is ensuing when it just goes to the heart of basic British fairness and values. Yeah, Rob, what are your thoughts on the row?
Well, I think it's a bad row for the Tories to really lean into, because it's not a popular cause. That said, in answer to what you're saying, education has been a charitable purpose since the age of, and recognised as such since the age of Queen Elizabeth. The first one, not the second one. And it is, and one of the principles of charity is that we don't tell charities that they need to do the following things because government says they do. Then they stop being charities and just become an arm of the state. I think educating people is a charitable purpose. If you impose extra costs on private schools, you send more kids into the state sector and increase the costs to the state. But actually, I think what the Tories should be talking about is the fact that education is one of the areas where they have a really good story to tell over the last few years. Thanks to the Gove revolution, which built on the Adonis and Blair revolution, the number of private schools has been falling. One of the reasons why private schools tend to be becoming more exclusive is because the quality of state schools has been going up. More parents have been seeing, actually, it makes sense to put my kids into the local state, and that's the number of outstanding schools has gone up, even though we've toughened up qualifications. That's a really good thing. But I don't see. I think I agree. Public schools and private schools should do more to help their local communities. But the language about they are getting handouts. They're not getting handouts. They're educating people and they're not paying VAT on it.
I fundamentally disagree with the idea that education is charity. Education is a basic right, and it's a right for everybody in this country to have a decent education. And at the moment, not everybody is. And there is a deep unfairness. And I think we saw that through COVID, particularly during the pandemic, as to disadvantaged areas being penalised more, not just because of the school that they're studying in, but because of the housing that they're in, because of the area that they're in, because of the digital deprivation.
Yeah, so it'd be great if Labour could come up with some education policies for the state sector, which they really haven't done, rather than rabbiting on about
key one
schools.
Is taking this £1.7 billion and helping those children get on in life. And one of those things is around mental health and support for them to get on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm out myself as a private school pupil. Shocker. I work in journalism, and my school had a swimming pool which the local primary schools use, which was seen as a very that's how they got the charitable status, doing things like that. But I don't understand why. Even as a pupil, I thought, well, surely the money that we saved as a charity could be used to building a leisure centre around the corner for people to use normally. It didn't have to be done this way, essentially, and that's what I think people find it hard to understand, why it has to be done in this way.
And that's it. The language that you used was they let them use it.
Yeah.
It is not theirs. It's not. It's you're allowed to use this. You're allowed to borrow it. You're allowed to come in. And that therefore reinforces that barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin, anyone want to come on this?
Yeah, I've got a feeling this is going to be the sort of 2022's version of the banker's bonus tax, where absolutely every pledge you ever want to put out ends up, funny enough, is going to be paid by a group that you don't...
Corporation tax increases,
or various
non-doms.
So, yeah,
I mean, we're into the billions.
But let's just focus for a moment. Look, I'm a comprehensive school kid. My family could not have afforded to send me to a private school, but I do not see the logic of this at all. And also, we could extend this, if this is the philosophy now, that if well, what about the charitable status on various other things, sports clubs? This is just an absolute nonsense. And the idea that having a reasonable independent school nearby impacts on the state sector is literally for the birds. That's why, to be honest, Labour didn't make this change for 13 years of its government. It left this status in place. So we are seeing, I've actually agreed with the point just made, that we are seeing in communities where state schools are improving, including Torbay, where I represent, that actually independent schools have declined in popularity. I've had 2 closed since I was the MP there, because the local schools have transformed. I can think of one, Ellicombe Academy in the middle of one of those deprived communities, absolutely transformed by the type of policies Michael Gove put forward. In fact, Michael visited it a few years back to see firsthand what was done. So this idea that shutting them down, it makes a good headline, it makes something that I'm sure will be cheered at a Labour conference, but the actual impact on the ground is not going to be transformative. And again, I'd just say people can look at Wales and try and consider whether that is better than here in England.
I think, it's not about shutting them down. People can still have the choice. They just need to be financially viable and not have a tax break, which could have gone to children in state education. And if, they think that that's a popular policy and they want to go to the wall on this, then happy to go to a general election on it.
Oh, well, we'll see how that goes.
What a boring general election.
Yeah, well,
2 months.
Well, I think, to be honest, it'll be interesting to see how, we saw how well last time around the politics of envy went down. So we'll see how much they go on in future. This
is a politics of equality and accessibility for good education for all. And I think the majority of the public want to see good education for their children.
Absolutely no difference to, in my own constituency, for example, where I have different communities who have now got really good state schools, about their access to education, whether there's a school down the road that doesn't charge VAT on top of this. But what would make a difference is if 20% of those pupils then had to come back into the state's back into the state sector, which is completely ignored in this policy.
I think probably your parents that do send their children to state schools would probably like a share of that 1.7 billion that currently goes to propping up private schools.
Well, it doesn't. This is about charging tax on top of fees. So actually, you're assuming the demand stays the same. I think putting 20% on something, it's rare the demand and the number of people buying it stays the same.
Right, well, let's have another go. Let's move on from private schools. Let's have another go at the Conservative Party.
Quite literally, let's have another go.
Yeah,
certainly having a few goes at us, so it'd be good to get onto.
Well, it is 1 against 2.
Well, to be fair, yeah.
As Robert pointed out earlier, there's an awful lot of ex-ministers. There's an awful lot of, and it feels like the power of patronage from the whips is not really there as much as it was previously. You can't sort of dangle things in front of people because it's much harder now after we're 12 years into a government, etc., etc. Do you think that means that it's going to be difficult for Sunak to bring the party together, unite the party going forward? Do you think you are a bit of a rabble at the moment, or would you if we're going to have if we're going to go for it, let's go for it. Are you a rabble at the moment, or are you going to together?
I wouldn't say we're a rabble. We are still a group that has come together. This week we've had finance bill go through difficult stuff, things that aren't there, and we have not seen razor-thin votes because of large numbers of rebellions.
It's mainly because you haven't voted on a lot of the difficult things that have been sort of pushed down there and tabled a lot of the hard things.
Well, but still, people want to express their disagreement. They find opportunities to do so. I think it's safe to say. But actually, look, we're all united together around what we need to do. We can see that there are challenges for the country, and inevitably, when there are difficult times, there are going to be debates about what the future are. Particularly if you're in government, we haven't got the luxury of opposition where you can sort of say one thing 1 month and then 6 months later forget that and say something completely different. But for ourselves, there is a good team there. We are looking to work together. Yeah, there's the odd disagreement, but the odd thing. But things like whether we have onshore wind or not is not a absolute fundamental to how we manage the economy and how we manage public services.
Yeah, Rob, how do you see it then?
I think there's two sides to this. I mean, generally speaking, the Tory party has become more rebellious and more fractious, as has Parliament. I think there is just a general tendency now for MPs more to see themselves more as the tribunes of their constituencies. But as Kevin alluded to, the finance bill from the autumn statement, even though it contained an awful lot of things that everyone in the Tory party hated, really bitter medicine to swallow, actually went through with the biggest majority of everything since January. So I think there is a general sort of overarching. People do buy the analysis that look, we've got rid of two leaders. We can't do this again. We need, we do need to actually unite. But at the same time, you do hear people saying, the really familiar complaints that Number 10 isn't doing enough to talk to backbenchers. It needs to listen to us more. It needs to liaise more.
That's
absolutely perennial. The thing that we've done the painful stuff now with the autumn statement. So now in the spring with the budget, we need need Rishi and Jeremy to set out a positive and optimistic and vote something that might actually convince people to vote for us. Maybe would be nice. But also just there is a sense that there's quite a lot of people who are. Who there's less leverage over, and another factor is obviously is that apparently now whips can't go around making dark threats to destroy people's lives and careers or expose their secrets because in the kind of classic House of Cards fashion, it's kind of symbolic that Gavin Williamson has been booted out, and Simon Hart is the chief whip, who is very much someone who's I think liked rather than feared.
He's the good cop without a bad cop.
I'd say as a whip that's probably the more effective of the two.
Sure.
I would never want to disappoint somebody that I liked.
I just know that this house was just a fantastic piece of theatre. I like to imagine that that's still happening. But.
Kevin, just on one of the things as well is that we're seeing a number of MPs, your colleagues, saying they're going to stand down and not stand at the next election. Do you think that's also part of this kind of feeling that there's coming to the end of an administration, that you've got people, someone like Chloe Smith, who's on the podcast a few weeks ago, she's only 40, Will Ragg's only 34, he's standing down. The people who should be starting their parliamentary careers are actually saying, you know what, I'm going to sack it in,
There are some that are less surprising. So, for example, Gary Streeter recently announced his retirement, has been an MP for 30 years and is in his late 60s, and there's a number of Labour MPs who are stepping down as well. And also, about now is the time we'd start seeing people having to make that decision of, right, I've now got to either commit to
Yeah.
being standing.
Well, they've literally
or
been
not.
told you have to tell us by December.
December the 5th, yeah.
And some people like myself their local associations had already reselected, so some had already confirmed. But yeah, it's brought that to a head now that probably now you need to start making your mind up. And similarly, people will move on. And also, of course, some people, their constituencies are being abolished. And I think the era when you could...
Skidmore, I think, is one of his
and I think, and Andrew Percy as well. And the era when we remember it back in the 90s, would happen in all parties, the boundary changes, and someone would suddenly go from representing part of London to being standing in Yorkshire or things like that. That doesn't work well. That doesn't go down well with electorate. And increasingly, local parties are less inclined to select someone whose seat's been abolished and is now being dropped off somewhere else. So again, those sorts of things can have a factor in people's decisions.
Yeah, as pointed out, lots of Labour MPs, but it feels more the Labour MPs, people like Harriet Harman, Margaret Hodge,
Rosie.
Margaret Beckett. Yeah, it feels like there's more of a kind of a changing of the...
all women.
I feel like there's a bit of a changing of the guard, maybe. That there's a feeling that Labour are going to come into power, maybe, and it's a chance to let some younger MPs come in and feel what it's like to actually not be in opposition for 12 years.
And they've also served a very long time.
Yeah.
If you look at Harriet, for example, she's had an entire career. She's the mother of the house.
Yeah. And Beckett was, I think, even earlier than that. When she
And I
was
suspect there was
elected.
some who didn't stand down last time round because of who might be selected to replace them, but have stayed on this time round.
Also,
perhaps more confidence in who might follow them on.
But because they also had things to do still. And they have, things have changed. And I think the last 2 to 3 years probably has brought into some perspective what is most important to people, particularly later on in their careers. But I do think it is pretty shocking that Will Ragg and that Deanna, for example, and Chloe, that are stepping down. Because, as you say, and I love the fact you said only 40. But these are young people. It is not easy to get elected. This is not something that you just wake up one day and go, I'm going to be an MP. This is something that you have to really think about. You have to work at. You have to know that this is what you want to do. And it is I think we do have to look at ourselves and ask some questions why it is some of the younger politicians and some of the younger Tory politicians are choosing to step away from something that they wanted to do so much.
And I think it's a real mistake if we talk about this as just a sort of Tory dysfunction thing. I think there is just a much bigger thing that we really have to think about the quality of politicians, the type of people who come into politics. And I'm always so impressed when people I know, or I meet MPs who are who are the kind of people you'd want to have in Parliament. Because the truth is, there are just a lot of people who look at that and look at the pressures under it, especially women, especially the vicious abuse you get for being female on the internet. And it is like, I mean, I would never want to be an MP. I did some work experience when I was 18. It was just enough to know. I just you just have. It is just such a rare thing, but it's become worse. It's become tougher, and you see fewer and fewer people wanting to do it. I think, or I mean, you can definitely see. And like the money is much worse than people could get. The kind of people you'd hope would get into Parliament is often worse than you can. There's a whole complex of factors around that.
Yeah, I think the Conservative Party worked really hard to try and get more women into Parliament. The numbers are still about 25%, isn't it, of the parliamentary party is female. But then if you're, the difficulties in becoming an MP, do you think that's going to put more off going into the future, do you think?
Yeah, I think we've got to desperately try and avoid the idea that rhino skin is becoming one of the main attributes you have to have in politics. It's right to highlight particular experience of female colleagues, particularly Ruth Smith, one of your former colleagues. The torrent of abuse she was getting was absolutely unbelievable. Fair play to her for the way she carried on with it.
Yeah.
But I started thinking, I'm a government MP and I'm voting for things that are not going to please everyone. Inherently, you end up doing that in government. And for opposition MPs getting absolute torrents of abuse and stuff. You just sit there thinking, we can't have a situation where rhino skin and ability to put up with constant attacks on social media is the main attribute you need in politics.
Absolutely, but I think what it is that there is a different standard to which we are held. So although you and Nus Ghani would have voted on exactly the same things, Nus would have had it a lot worse than you, for example.
I agree.
And I don't want to see people put off at all, because I always go into, when I say to primary school kids, I say, come into Parliament because this is your place as much as it is everybody else's. No, you can't vote, but I work for you. Like, this should be your place and it should be your safe space. And it really, really pains me when I see examples where I can't say to a kid in Luton, this is somewhere for you, and this is somewhere that you will be able to thrive and have equal opportunities and be heard in the same way as somebody else sat next to you.
Just one last thing before we wrap up. Talking about abuse, you had a bit of a spat in the Commons this week. Do you think the conduct needs to improve maybe in the Commons in some...
Massively, but I think I went in eyes wide open. And as much as Kevin says that you shouldn't have rhino skin, I think knowing that this is what is going to face you when you come in and be part of that change. I want to be part of that change. Yeah. And, I will always lean into it, but it shouldn't be happening. It shouldn't be happening. There is absolutely no reason why a woman who is representing and standing up for her constituents should be told to sit down and shut up.
Yeah.
But I've had women write to me from Sedgefield, from West Brom, that have said that this happens to them in their workplace or in their school, in their education, in every part of their lives. So this isn't just a parliamentary problem. This is a problem where actually I think there should be some leadership from us, because we set the tone, we set the example that the rest of society takes its lead from. And that's the same for the media as well.
That's all we've got time for this week, but you can read all the latest on the big stories from Westminster at PoliticsHome.com and keep right up to date by subscribing to our 7-day-a-week newsletters by clicking on the link in the top right corner of the website. Thanks to my fantastic guests Kevin Foster, Sarah Owen, Robert Colvile. Our editor today was Laura Silver. Thanks to you all again for listening. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from and leave us a review. If you want to get in touch, then reach out to us on Twitter at PoliticsHome or email us via news@politicshome.com. But for now, I've been Alain Tolhurst, and this has been The Rundown.